good to go. Hi, this is Ned Desmond from GoFISHn, and I'm here with Eric Schwaab, the Assistant Administrator for the National Marine Fisheries Service. How are you this afternoon, Eric?
Hi, Ned. I'm great. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to talk for a few minutes about some of the issues that Eric's dealing with here at NOAA. And I wanted to kick off with just a general observation. It was back in March that Bob Montgomery wrote that controversial piece in ESPN questioning the administration's commitment to the interests of recreational fishermen. But a lot has changed since then. I wonder if you could tick off a few of the things that have come to pass that probably should soften the concerns about recreational fishing not being taken into account by the administration.
Yeah, absolutely, Ned. And even before I arrived on the scene, Dr. Lubchenco had made some strong commitments to the recreational fishing community regarding better engagement, improved opportunities for involvement, as well as increased attention to the issues of concern to the recreational fishing community. So very early on in my tenure here, which dates to a little over 6 months ago now, we had already begun to take some steps to reach out to the recreational fishing community. One of those steps was to create a recreational fishing subcommittee within our major advisory group, the Marine Fish Advisory Committee, which then put together a work group of 22 interested recreational representatives from around the country from various aspects of the recreational community. And they helped us to put together a national recreational fishing summit, which we held back in, I believe, June. We had good representation from all over the country at that summit. The summit was preceded by a questionnaire which allowed us to frame conversations with participants. The participants that we heard from afterward almost unanimously felt like it was a great opportunity to talk about and to highlight issues of importance to the recreational community. And they run the gamut from obvious ones like recreational catch and effort data to allocation issues, specifically as it might relate to some new policy initiatives like catch shares, as well as more general issues related to engagement at the regional and national levels. And each of those things are things that we're working on aggressively now.
Mm-hmm. Well, historically, NOAA, at least in the eyes of recreational fishermen, had a kind of commercial fisherman bias. Maybe bias is too strong a word, but that was their principal mission. Do you think that, in the past year or so, that NOAA has alleviated that sense on the part of recreational fishermen, or gotten a start anyway?
Well, I would like to think that most directly in the past year or so, we have certainly worked aggressively to change any lingering perceptions in that regard. Obviously, even before that time, I think the work of the agency had expanded so substantially that even some of those lingering concerns about our focus just on commercial issues might have been a bit dated. We have extensive interests in, for example, habitat restoration in coastal and marine areas. We have long-standing commitments to protected resources, marine mammals, endangered aquatic species, and the like. All of those things, in addition to representing some of the social and economic interests of recreational fishermen and commercial fishermen, come together in this one place in, I think, very unique and interesting ways.
Great. Well, let's turn to the issue of closures next. Is there a way to generalize in terms of how many closures are in effect now across NOAA's area of concern?
Well, actually, Ned, that's probably is a tough question because closures originate for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different ways. So we've had long-standing issues related to, for example, closures associated with marine sanctuaries, other types of marine protected areas, and there have been, I think, fairly healthy discussions about those types of closures within the fishing community, including recreational fishermen, for a number of years now. Now, if you're talking more specifically about closures such as that occurring in the South Atlantic related to red snapper conservation, they become smaller in number and a little more, I guess, a little easier to talk about, if you will.
Well, why don't we confine the question to that then? The ones related to stocks management, I guess.
Sure, sure. So, but even in that case, I'd be hard pressed to put a finger on, where there is a large full-time area closure in place, are really pretty few and far between. And even in that case, we're really talking about, specific to bottom fishing for reef fish. And, as I think you probably know, the reason that came about was because of the fact that a directed fishery closure for red snapper in and of itself was not meeting the goals of rebuilding the red snapper stock. And that was occurring because of the fact that you had bycatch mortality. So people that were out there fishing for other reef fish species were catching red snapper, discarding them, and that discard mortality was so substantial that it had the potential to undermine the rebuilding effort. And that's why the council ultimately made the recommendation to us, and we have moved down this road of large area closure, one which, by the way, is still very much in managerial discussion as we both look at how we achieve our conservation objectives there, simultaneous to obtaining a new stock assessment, which we hope will give us more up-to-date information on which to reevaluate that strategy.
Well, two related questions. The information, the data associated with the red snapper closure, there were lots of questions about it. And to some extent, under the Magnuson-Stevens Act as amended under the Bush administration, it almost doesn't matter. Certain things have to take place. But let's begin with the data itself. I mean, what level of confidence does NOAA have in its understanding of the red snapper stocks at the moment?
So we're required to use the best available science, and we're required to meet some pretty stringent deadlines associated with ending overfishing and rebuilding stocks. We do have some particular problems and concerns in the southeast with respect to the timeliness of our data. Dating back into the early 90s, I would say that it's fair to say that we have not gotten the frequency of stock assessment that we would like to have to manage the fishery most effectively. Now, some of that has led to the position that we're in with the stock, and I don't think there's any disagreement that there's a problem with the red snapper stock in the South Atlantic. There is some disagreement over the magnitude of that problem, and that's one of the things that we're hoping to get a better handle on with the stock assessment that is underway right now. And as I said a moment ago, we hope to have some new data before the end of this year on which to base a refinement of our management strategies. I will say, specific to the South Atlantic and the Southeast in general, that we have dedicated substantial new resources to stock assessment work in that region in particular because of the acute problems there relating to timeliness of stock assessments. So in many cases, we really like to have stock assessments, and it varies by species, but that are certainly not more than 2 or 3 years old. And in this case, we haven't been able to achieve that kind of a frequency, even with major stocks like red snapper, and we need to correct that, and we're working to do so.
Can you talk about that in budgetary terms?
So we, in 2010, obtained an additional $10 million nationally to support stock assessment work. That's over and above the base that existed prior to that year. And of that $10 million, we sent $5 million into the southeast, particularly because of the concerns that we had for some of the frequency of assessments that were down there.
And does this mean NOAA vessels are down there conducting research, or?
So it's a variety. It's NOAA vessels, but it's also then taking data from other sources and crunching that data on a regular basis into a good picture of what's happening in the stock.
So a new picture may emerge in December that leads to changes.
We are hopeful that we'll have new data in December that will help us to evaluate more closely the short and long-term strategy there in the South Atlantic. I think there's another part of this that is particularly important to recreational fishermen as we look at how we do a better job of managing stocks like red snapper in the South Atlantic. So here's a stock that we all know is subject to substantial fishing pressure. We can debate the magnitude of the challenge, but we all know that there are some rebuilding needs associated there. And yet we all share an interest in continuing to provide fishing, not only for red snapper, but for species that coexist with red snapper. So in addition to this idea of the relatively blunt tool, if you will, of a large area closure or even a directed fishery closure, we need to think creatively both in this agency and outside of the agency about alternative management techniques. Are there ways to, for example, minimize discard mortality? Are there ways to avoid pockets of species that are in greatest need of conservation? And so in addition to all of the other things that we're doing related to stock assessment, we are working very aggressively in the region and nationally in conversation with fishermen to find ways to decrease discard mortality, to decrease bycatch of species that are particularly in need of conservation. And I think that there is some important work that needs to occur there, and I didn't want to let that question go by without addressing that.
I'm glad you addressed it, because that's you're right. That's something that comes up frequently. Is there something else that can be done besides closures, besides waiting until the last possible moment?
No, that's exactly right.